when I really realized that Katie is the one for me, when she wrote about a cat just ripping a raccoon apart. And it's just so great.
From the Center for the Study of Teaching and Writing at The Ohio State University, this is Writer's Talk. I'm Nick White, a graduate student in the Creative Writing program at Ohio State. I am joined today with the fiction writer Michael Kardos and the poet Catherine Pierce, both of whom are graduates of the Masters of Fine Arts program here at OSU. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Michael Kardos is the author of the novel The 3-Day Affair and the award-winning story collection One Last Good Time. His short stories have appeared in the Southern Review, Crazy Horse, Prairie Schooner, Blackbird, Prism International, and many other magazines and anthologies, and were cited as notable stories in the 2009, 2010, and 2012 editions of Best American Short Stories. Mike, Tom Franklin said about your novel, "I dare you to pick up The 3-Day Affair and read a page or two and then put it down. It can't be done. With a combination of dread and glee, I tore through this book and was sorry when it was over." And I was wondering, when you wrote this novel, what came first? Was it the characters, or was it the intense plot, the suspenseful plot, or was it a mix of the both?
The novel had a very particular origin, which was a number of years ago. And actually, I think when I was here at Ohio State, I had read a newspaper article about a bus driver in D.C. who had a bunch of kids in his bus, and he was preoccupied with something in his home life, and he skipped one of the stops and was then so concerned about that, he skipped one of the other stops and then ended up skipping more and more. And before he knew it, he had hijacked his own school bus. And I just thought that was great, and I didn't want to read any more about the article. And I ended up writing a story about a bus driver who essentially did that, and that became the title story in the collection. But I didn't feel like I was done yet playing with this idea of a guy he's not a bad guy, but given enough time, he might even make some good decisions. But because he's driving, he doesn't have enough time to make those kinds of decisions and ends up making really bad ones. And so the novel is a different set of characters and a different circumstance, but that's kind of what kicked it off for me, with this idea of put a guy in a car, give him a really good reason to stop and a really good reason not to stop, and then see what happens. So I think there was a bit of, I knew that would be a little fast-paced there early on. And I think the pacing is something that happened so much by feel that just the more I got working on the novel, the more I got the feel of the pacing. And part of that is going sort of a back forward between the present action and the flashbacks.
You mentioned One Last Good Time, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little on the differences or the unexpected challenges from writing a short story to writing a novel.
I think the biggest difference for me is that the stakes were bigger. You know, the story collection has 10 stories in it, but I probably wrote 20. And the ones that weren't working as well, you can chalk it up to a learning experience and move on, or maybe, it ended up being a different kind of story that I did something else with that didn't end up in the book. The novel, because you spend a long time, years working on the same sustained narrative, the stakes just felt higher for me, where, if the novel totally didn't work, and it blew up in my face, I guess I could say, well, at least I learned something. But it's a harder thing to say to yourself when you spend that kind of time on it. So to me, that was the biggest difference.
All right. Did you set out to write a quote-unquote thriller, or did that moniker just get sort of tacked on by critics and editors?
Yes. Well, what happened was I didn't set out to write a thriller, but I also didn't set out to not write a thriller. In other words, I tried to set out to write the kind of book I wanted to read. And there's certainly a crime right at the middle of the story. It happens in the first chapter, and the whole rest of the novel deals with essentially trying to undo the crime. So it's not a shock that it was called a crime novel, but I didn't really think about that consciously. And then when the book went out to my agent and she sent it out to publishers, it ended up in the hands of a crime publisher, Mysterious Press. I'm really glad. I think it's helped a lot sort of position the book, but it was the same, it's not like I set out consciously to do that.
In the Huffington Post article that you wrote about which I love the graph, by the way, that you did, but of literary fiction and genre fiction.
Thanks.
And you found that your books that you liked sort of fell in the middle of that continuum. And I was just wondering, would you place your book in that middle?
I think so. The continuum was this, it was kind of tongue in cheek, but I think there was also something useful in there. This idea that, on the one end and the other end, we had, an easy book, however you define easy, and then on the other end, difficult, however you define difficult. And then in the other directions, we had stuff and no stuff. So a novel with stuff would be, a hardcore science fiction novel that takes place in outer space with, attack whales with, space fins or whatever. And then at the very bottom would be something completely realistic. And the novels I've been liking recently, and probably have always liked the best, are those books that sit somewhere in the middle that, like I'm thinking about writers like Jonathan Lethem, who's writing detective novels, kind of, or Richard Price, who's, again, like detective novels, kind of, or a novel that I loved recently was City of Thieves by David Benioff. Writers like Tom Perrotta or Nick Hornby, are they writing commercial fiction or literary fiction? I don't really know, but I like them. They have good stories and they're well written. So that is, I guess, something that I tried to emulate. And I'll be reading from the 3rd chapter of The 3-Day Affair. And I think the only thing that needs to be known is that these friends have kidnapped a young woman, taken her to a recording studio, and she is now there. She looks cold, Jeffrey said. She was sitting on the rug, arms around knees, head down, shivering, maybe crying. I'll be right back, I said. Where are you going? Nolan asked. I ignored him and went into the main recording room and turned up the thermostat. Then I knelt in front of the bass drum and pulled out the blanket that I kept in there to dampen the drum head. The blanket was stiff and musty. Back up a little, okay? I called through the thick door. She scooted backward. Her hair was dripping. I unlocked the door and opened it just enough to hand her the blanket. She took it and immediately wrapped it around herself. So can I please call you by a name? I asked. And she looked at me. But I didn't know what else to say. I wondered who she was, this girl of the milk and bread. Did she work there to save money for college? To help support her family? Did she have a boyfriend? What were her ambitions? I wanted her to understand that this was all a mistake, but I couldn't think of a way to explain, and there was no time. I started to close the door. Wait, she said. The door remained a few inches open. This is scary, you know? I know it is, I said. The police are probably already on their way, she said. It's possible. You really didn't know this was going to happen? Scout's honor. That guy's your friend? I nodded. He's all right once you get to know him. Her shivering had subsided a little. Marie, that's my name. I knew it was my turn, and lying seemed pointless. I'm Will. Is that your real name? Yes, I said. Is Marie yours? Her answer was a sneeze. For the first time, I really looked at her. The freckles at the base of her nose said tomboy, and yet she had smooth, feminine skin, the look of someone who could make herself glamorous if she wanted to. I'd been wrong about seeing her before in the milk and bread. That wasn't why she looked familiar. My Nana is sick, she said. She doesn't have anyone else. It's just me and her. My shift ends at 8 o'clock and I'm supposed to go home after. Of course she had a grandmother depending on her. We're going to do everything we can to get you home on time, I said. I promise. Will, she said. What is it? Please don't let anyone hurt me. I looked away and saw the nicked-up wooden floor, the rotted ceiling tiles, microphone stands and cables lining the wall. One of Joey's posters of Pamela Anderson circa 1995 for the musicians to ogle. This was Joey's studio, but it was my turf. Jeffrey might have grabbed the girl, and Nolan might have ordered me to drive, but I had taken us here. I was responsible, and she seemed to know it, and she was letting me know that she knew it. What if I told her right then, just run as fast as you can into the street? Would anybody stop her? And why wasn't I giving her that chance? Optimism is a strange word given the situation, but I believe that's what kept me from letting her go right then, before everything else that happened. I was as frightened as I'd ever been, yet alongside my fear was a trace of optimism because I knew what this girl didn't. We meant her no harm. Together, Nolan, Jeffrey, and I would solve the problem, fix the damage that had been done. All we needed was a little time. Nobody's going to hurt you, I said. We're going to get you home soon. In the meantime, try to warm up. I clicked the door shut.
Catherine Pierce is the author of 2 books of poetry, The Girls of Peculiar and Famous Last Words, and the chapbook Animals of Habit. Her poems have appeared in the Best American Poetry, Slate, Boston Review, Plowshares, Field, the Cincinnati Review, Court Green, Arts and Letters, and elsewhere. You write a lot about the high school experience, which I relate to. Even though I was not a girl. What is it about that time in our lives that interests you so much as a poet?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that what it was for me is that that's a time when a lot of things are in flux. So you have pressures coming at you from all sides. There's the pressures of youth and of kind of hanging on to childhood, but there are also the pressures of entering adulthood, the adult world. And I think it's a time when it's possible to feel very much in 2 separate worlds simultaneously. You feel youthful and you feel hopefully hopeful and you feel like anything could happen. At the same time, you might also feel kind of world weary as you're beginning to realize all these challenges that you will face as an adult and as you start to sort of make that move into adulthood. And so I was really interested in that tension that exists for me, and it seemed to me like a very rich ground for poetry.
From final words from infamous people through history and to Cassell's Dictionary of Superstitions, you seem to find a lot of prompts for your poems, and I was just wondering, how do you come across your material? Does it find you, or do you find it, and how do you know?
I do use a lot of I've written a lot of series of poems. So what you mentioned were the Cassels. I found, actually at Half Price Books in Columbus a few years ago, I found a copy of Cassell's Dictionary of Superstitions. It was $6. I thought it sounded interesting, so I bought it. And so I started writing a series of poems based on the different definitions of superstitions in that book, or write the famous last words. I think that I'm always looking for, I like writing series because it helps me to, it gives me a current to ride. And it also helps me to move out of myself somewhat and try to access a different kind of story. So I think I'm always on the lookout for things like that. I wouldn't say that it's so much a conscious search, but I think that I am always kind of keeping an eye out for things like that appeal to me. The Last Words poems, I had written a poem about the last words of Billy the Kid, which were Q&S, or Who Is It, which he said right before he was shot by the sheriff, Pat Garrett. And I was so interested in that whole idea and in building this world around those last words that it appealed to me so much I wanted to keep going with it. So often I'll write one, and then if I like it, I'll keep going. But I'm always kind of on the lookout.
Nice. This is sort of a broad question, I know, but I'm curious about this. You've written 3 books now, and I was wondering, like, from your chapbook Animals of Habit to now your latest one, how have you changed probably most as a poet? Aesthetically or subject material?
I think there have been a few changes. With the chapbook Animals of Habit, I think I was working very hard not to write autobiographically, because prior to that point I had been pretty much only been writing autobiographically, and so I wanted to break out of that. So those poems, most of them have to do with something outside of myself. The next book sort of blended those worlds, and then the most recent book, while it's not autobiographical necessarily, I do think that those poems feel probably to a reader somewhat more personal. So I think that's been a shift that I've made, trying to find ways to blend those different types of writing.
Would you say you had to come back to yourself, probably?
Yeah, in a way. I think I had to sort of learn I needed to learn how to use lenses in the right way. Rather than just sort of coming at something directly, I needed to find a way to filter it through something else. So that's one thing that I've been kind of working on lately. And aesthetically, I think that with the last book in particular, with The Girls of Peculiar, those poems, I was particularly interested in paying attention to sound and to cutting all the fat from those poems. So there are a lot of short poems in the book, and there are some longer poems too, but all of those poems started much longer and then got shorter and shorter and shorter as I tried to trim them down to their essences. So that was something that I was really focused on in that last book. This is a poem called Dear Atom Bomb. Dear Atom Bomb, I confess, you were my high school obsession. You bloomed inside my chest until I howled. You shook me with your booming zillion wattage. You were bigger than rock and roll. I lost days to you, the way you expanded to become more than even yourself. In science class movies, you puffed men like microwaved marshmallows, raked blood from their insides, and always I could feel your heat like a massive cloak around my shoulders. You embarrassed me. You were too depraved for dignity, not caring whose eyes you melted, whose innards oozed. You balled up control in your god-huge palms and tossed it into the stratosphere. Oh, atom bomb, I miss you. These days, my mind is no incandescent blur, but a narrow infrared beam spotlighting bounded fears. Cancer in a single throat, a shock of blood on the clean sheets, a careless turn from the grocery store lot into the pickup with the pit bull in the bed. Oh, atom bomb, come back. Take me away from the twitch in my leg, the cracking lead paint, the lurking salmonella. Sweep me up in your blinding white certainty. Make me sure once again that I'll live till the world's brilliant end. And this poem is called For This You Have No Reason. In Sacramento, a Virgin Mary has begun spilling blood from its stone eyes. Articles offer theories. A prank, a rusting mineral. There is no explanation, I say over and over, my heart tensed like a fist. Once at Chez La Mer, I watched a magician turn silver coins into yellowfin tuna while diners oohed. When the room shuddered with calls for the big reveal, I ducked outside, humming to cover the sound of the secret. Here are facts. The dog gone for a decade makes its way to Arizona and finds its family still pining, now joy-struck. The wooden Christ in St. Stephen's Cathedral grows hair and is groomed every year before Easter. A friend's father saw 3 UFOs zoom into a lit triangle, then shoot to far corners of the lake-dark sky. He was not a man who lied. For years, I found playing cards face down on sidewalks, and each was the Jack of Hearts. Absurd, but I swear this is true. Here, each face said, for this you have no reason. Each new finding shores up something always close to collapse inside my ribs. Let these strangenesses be like the impossible lizard's tail, gone forever, because how could it be otherwise? And then reappearing, iridescent and blood-warmed, because how could it be otherwise?
Both live in Starkville, Mississippi, where they teach and co-direct the creative writing program at Mississippi State University. They are also married, and full disclosure, are former professors and mentors of mine. Both of you have been living in Mississippi, my old stomping ground, for how many years now?
5.
Yeah.
Mississippi has a rich literary tradition. How has living in the South affected your writing, or has it?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, the briefest answer is I don't know. I've tried to write Mississippi stories. You know, usually I can't write about a place until I'm no longer living there. And I've written 2 stories that take place in Mississippi. And the first one, I really don't know if it's working or not. But the second one, which I like better, features a narrator from New Jersey who's living in Mississippi. And I think, like you're talking about lenses a minute ago, I think this idea of perceiving the world through a character who's not from there, which is kind of what I do, made it a little bit easier to write about Mississippi. So I think that's one change. But as far as, the sort of more like the zeitgeist of Mississippi, I don't know how it's exactly changed me as a writer. It probably has in some way.
For me, up until about 2 years ago, I couldn't have probably answered this question very well. I mean, I think that, I'd written a few poems that had to do with Mississippi, but like Mike said, I wasn't quite sure if they were working, and I also wanted to have better distance from what I was writing about. But a couple years ago, there was the tornado outbreak that happened in the Deep South, and that day, I've been thinking about this anyway because we do have a lot of, as you know, tornado warnings frequently in Mississippi, and I'd already been wanting to write some poems about tornadoes, but after that terrifying day, it kind of exploded as a project, and so I'm working now on a new book, a series of poems that have this tornado outbreak at their heart, or at least a tornado, not necessarily that day. But it's about a series of poems about a town impacted by a tornado. And so I have recurring characters, and one of them is the tornado itself. And I have different sort of people that the book or the poems in this hypothetical book follow. And that's directly influenced by having lived in the South for a number of years and having experienced what the weather systems are like there.
You have recently become parents to the adorable baby Sam. And I was wondering, how has becoming a parent affected you as a writer?
Okay. I think there are a few ways. One is sort of, again, the aesthetic choices that we make, and then the other is just the practical reality of it. In terms of the poems, some of the poems that I'm dealing with now or that I'm working on now do have, one of the recurring characters in this tornado series is a mother, and she has a child. And so that's kind of what I mean when I talk about that lens or that filter. She's not me, and the child is not Sam, but I'm obviously drawing on my own experiences, my own feelings in writing that. So I do think that elements of that are coming out in my own poetry. But again, I want to have it filtered through something. I think that I'm more objective and better able to craft the poems that way. So that's coming out as a theme. Practically speaking, we just have to use our time a whole lot better than we ever did before. So during the summer, we worked in shifts. We would each take 3 hours. Mike would take 3 hours in the morning. I would take 3 hours in the afternoon. And we would go to the library and we would work for those 3 hours. And the rest of the time we'd hang out with Sam. And, I found that I can become really efficient when I need to be. So that's been a change for me.
Yeah, the second part of that answer, absolutely. It's been the timing thing is really interesting. But I think as far as the work itself, I haven't really noticed a lot of I haven't written about parenthood, although I'm about to. In the thing I'm working on now, there is one of the characters does have a young daughter, and I think it's some of the practical things. Like I wouldn't have been able to write about the act of getting a child into a car seat in the back of a car, and like how to put the buckles on and what that feels like. So I think some of those practicalities, obviously.
All right, this last question is just a fun one for my own amusement. And Mike, I was wondering, what was your favorite poem by Katie, and why?
I think. Well, there's two.
Okay.
One is one of the poems that's a little more autobiographical that I particularly like.
Title?
But I want to talk about the other one.
Okay.
The other one, when I realized that Katie is the one for me, when she wrote about a cat just ripping a raccoon apart, and it's just so great and kind of gross, but it's really, really moving too. So, what's that poem called?
It's Instinct.
Instinct, yeah. And then after the animal just gets totally ripped apart, the next line is, "This is a love poem," which is just, it's really awesome.
Romantics. Katie, the same question for you. What is your favorite story and or longer piece that Mike has written, and why?
I love his work. I think that, my favorite one, I've gone back and forth. I think that in the story collection, I think the novel is amazing, and I think it's just fantastic, and it blows me away. I've read it a few times, and it blows me away every time. In terms of the short stories, I'm always a fan of, there's a story called Behind the Music, which you worked on here, actually. And it's about a boy who, among other things, sort of works in a haunted mansion for the summer and is going through some things in his personal life. And it's sort of a coming-of-age story. And I just find it really moving, and the end of it just really gets me every time. So that's one of my favorites.
All right. Thank you guys so much for coming. You were wonderful.
Thank you for having us.
From the Center for the Study and Teaching of Writing at Ohio State University, this was Nick White, and thank you, Writers Talk.